No, but, a lot of people ask me about that and say, what's the secret of Mrs. Brown? And I don't know if there is any secret about Mrs. Brown. She's a bitch. I mean, she's an old cow. I also think that she's at an age where she doesn't care what she says.
The real reason why these actors left Mrs. Brown's Boys. There is a specific kind of magic that happens when a television show stops feeling like a television show and starts feeling like a family you actually belong to. Most comedies spend years trying to manufacture that feeling and never quite get there. Mrs. Brown's Boys stumbled into it almost accidentally, built on chaos and flubbed lines and a man in a wig screaming at his fictional children. And somehow, it became one of the most watched comedies in British and Irish television history. People didn't just watch it. They claimed it. They defended it. They argued about it at Christmas dinner and then sat down and watched the Christmas special together anyway. But behind all of that warmth and laughter and audience devotion, something else was quietly happening. Cast members who had been part of the show for years, some of them from before the television cameras ever rolled, were making the decision to walk away. Some left gently, some left with their hearts broken, and some left in circumstances that ended up in courtrooms and newspaper headlines. The reasons are more complicated, more human, and in some cases more unsettling than most people realize. This is the real story of why they left and what it cost everyone involved. To understand any of that, you have to go back to where it all began, because Mrs. Brown's Boys is not a show that was dreamed up in a television boardroom by people in suits with market research folders. It started with one man, one idea, and a theatrical accident that changed the course of his life. Brendan O'Carroll had grown up surrounded by Irish matriarchs, women of a very specific type, loud and loving and absolutely immovable, the kind of women who kept families together through force of personality alone. He wanted to put that kind of woman on stage. He created Agnes Brown, a Dublin mother with a foul mouth and an enormous heart, and he began writing her into radio plays and eventually a novel called The Mammy, which found an audience that immediately understood exactly what he was doing. The character was originally intended to be performed by an actress. That plan collapsed at the worst possible moment, a live performance with an audience already seated, and a leading actress who simply did not appear. Brendan O'Carroll made a decision in that moment that was either extremely brave or extremely desperate, and it turned out to be one of the most consequential decisions in modern British comedy. He put on a dress, found a wig, stepped onto that stage, and became Agnes Brown. The audience responded with immediate, genuine delight. There was something about watching this particular man inhabit this particular character that was irresistible. Agnes Brown, born out of necessity and last-minute panic, turned out to be exactly what audiences had been waiting for without knowing it. The stage shows toured relentlessly. They found audiences in Ireland, in England, in Scotland, in Australia, wherever Irish communities had settled and carried their culture with them. The shows were rough in the most lovable way. Lines were missed. Jokes landed differently than planned. Brendan would sometimes step outside the script to address someone in the audience directly, and those unscripted moments were often the funniest parts of the night. There was a sense of being let in on something, of watching a performance that was too alive to be perfectly controlled. And surrounding all of it was a cast that was, in the most literal possible sense, a family. Brendan built the world of Mrs. Brown around the people closest to him. His wife, Jennifer Gibney, played Kathy, Agnes's daughter. His son Danny played Dermot. His daughter Fiona played Maria, Dermot's wife. His sister Eilish played the neighbor Winnie. Friends who had known Brendan for decades stepped into other roles. The result was a chemistry that professional casting simply cannot manufacture, because it wasn't created by a casting director. It grew out of decades of actual shared history. When these people looked at each other on stage or on camera, they were drawing on something real. The audience could feel it, even if they couldn't always explain why. When BBC One brought Mrs. Brown's Boys to television in 2011, critics were largely dismissive. The humor was considered old-fashioned. The production style, with its visible bloopers and fourth-wall-breaking moments and live studio audience, seemed deliberately throwback in an era of sophisticated, self-conscious comedy. Critics who valued prestige television found it easy to condescend. What the critics missed and what the audience understood immediately was that the show was doing something genuine in a landscape full of things that were trying very hard to appear genuine. The bloopers weren't accidents left in for laziness. They were a feature, a reminder that these were human beings rather than polished performers, that the whole enterprise was held together with love rather than technical precision. The show became a phenomenon. Christmas specials drew enormous audiences year after year. Live tours filled arenas. A feature film arrived in 2014. Merchandise, books, DVDs. The world of Mrs. Brown expanded outward in every direction. Brendan O'Carroll had not simply created a television show. He had created something closer to a movement, a place where a particular kind of humor and a particular kind of warmth had a permanent home. But the very things that made the show special also created conditions that were, for some of the people involved, genuinely difficult to sustain. And slowly, quietly at first, and then quite loudly, people began to leave. Fiona O'Carroll had been part of the Mrs. Brown universe before most of the television audience had ever heard of it. As Brendan's daughter, she had grown up alongside the show, watched it evolve from a modest stage production into a cultural institution, and contributed to that evolution through her performance as Maria Brown, Dermot's wife, and the woman most frequently tasked with being a reasonable person in a profoundly unreasonable household. Maria wasn't the loudest character in the room. She didn't get the biggest jokes or the most outrageous storylines. But she served a function that is easy to underestimate until it's gone. She was the show's grounding wire, the person the audience could identify with when everyone else was losing their minds. When news emerged in 2022 that Fiona would not be joining the live stage tour, the reaction from fans was one of genuine surprise. She had always seemed like a permanent fixture, one of the people who would be there as long as the show existed simply because of the depth of her connection to it. But what Fiona had been doing, quietly and over a long period of time, was reassessing her own life and what she wanted from it. She had reached her 40s. She had children who were growing up. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life playing a character in a world that her father had built. And she had reached a point where she needed to understand who she was outside of that context. She was disarmingly candid when she spoke about it publicly, describing the feeling of wanting to write her own story rather than continuing to inhabit someone else's. That's not a criticism of the show or of her father or of anything she had experienced. It's the kind of honest self-knowledge that most people struggle to act on even when they feel it clearly. Fiona felt it and acted on it. She emphasized repeatedly that there was no falling out, no argument, no drama beneath the surface. Her relationship with Brendan remained close and loving. He expressed pride in her decision and described her, with evident sincerity, as his daughter first and a cast member second. The gap left by Maria's absence was real, even if it was hard to quantify. When a show loses its loudest, most colorful character, audiences notice immediately. When it loses the quiet one, the one who has been providing balance and humanity without calling attention to the fact, the loss registers differently, more as a subtle wrongness than a gaping hole. The show became slightly more chaotic in Fiona's absence, slightly less anchored. Other characters stepped up, and the ensemble adjusted as ensembles do. But something that Fiona had been providing, a window through which ordinary people could enter this extraordinary family, was no longer there in quite the same way. She has since stepped away from the entertainment industry largely, focused on her family, and has spoken about her decision with nothing but clarity and peace. Rory Cowan's departure from the show in 2017 hit differently, because Rory was one of those performers whose presence seems to generate joy simply by existing. He had come into the world of Mrs. Brown not as an actor, but as Brendan's publicist, helping promote the early stage shows and working behind the scenes at a time when the whole enterprise was still finding its feet. When the role of Rory Brown, Agnes's son, flamboyant and devoted and impossible to ignore, needed to be filled, Brendan offered it to Rory on what was supposed to be a temporary basis. Temporary became permanent because Rory was simply too good at it to replace. His bleached hair, his instinctive comic timing, the particular quality of warmth he brought to the character's outrageousness. These things were his alone, and audiences recognized it immediately. For years, Rory Brown was one of the central joys of Mrs. Brown's Boys. His scenes with Brendan had a specific electricity, a kind of playful love that felt genuine because it largely was. And then, in 2017, Rory announced he was leaving, and the reason had nothing to do with the show at all. His mother had been ill for many years, and caring for her while maintaining the demands of an international touring show had taken a quiet, accumulating toll on him. When she passed away, Rory found himself confronting grief alongside a question about what his life was for and what it looked like going forward. He acknowledged openly that he had been emotionally absent from the show for some time before he made his exit official, going through the motions, performing a role, but not truly present inside it the way he had once been. The grief had created a distance that he could feel but couldn't bridge. His description of walking away was striking in its honesty. He said simply that he was sad on the show, that he wasn't enjoying it anymore, and that he needed to go. Not because of anger, not because of professional grievances, not because of anything that could be traced to a single incident or argument. Just because something fundamental had changed inside him, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it and act on it. That kind of honesty is rare and deserves to be recognized as such. The show recast the role of Rory Brown, bringing in Damien McKiernan, a former Mr. Ireland with limited acting experience, to step into what were quite obviously some of the largest shoes the show had to offer. The challenge was immense, and the comparison was unavoidable. Damien was not Rory Cowan. He didn't play the character the same way, didn't inhabit the role with the same energy, didn't share the same history with Brendan that made the original dynamic feel so effortless. He brought his own qualities, a quieter, more reserved interpretation that some viewers came to accept over time. But for many long-standing fans, the replacement never quite took. The character of Rory Brown survived the transition, but something essential about what made him special did not. Rory Cowan moved on to other work, including a role in the long-running Irish soap Fair City, which gave him a different kind of creative challenge and a chance to demonstrate that his gifts extended beyond the particular world of Mrs. Brown. He also wrote a memoir about his life, which was honest and affectionate, and gave a fuller picture of the person behind the character. He has not returned to Mrs. Brown's Boys, and there is no indication that he intends to. What he found on the other side of leaving was a life that felt more authentically his own, and by his own account, that has been worth the cost of the exit. Gary Hollywood's departure from the show in 2020 belongs in a different category entirely, because it was not quiet and it was not peaceful, and it did not resolve into anything resembling a clean ending. Gary played Dino Doyle, the stylish, sharp-tongued hairdresser, whose friendship with the Rory Brown character had made him one of the show's most recognizable and beloved presences. He had been part of the production for years and had built a loyal following among viewers who appreciated the very specific energy he brought to every scene he was in. When he disappeared from the 2020 Christmas and New Year specials without any on-screen explanation, fans immediately noticed and immediately started asking questions. The answers that emerged were uncomfortable. Gary alleged that he and Damien McKiernan had been paid substantially less than other cast members for those specials, and that when he raised this disparity as a concern, he found himself dismissed from future episodes rather than having the conversation he was trying to have. He described the experience as a profound sense of betrayal, not simply of a professional relationship, but of the idea of the show itself, which had always positioned itself as a family, as a group of people who genuinely cared for one another and stood by each other. To find that care apparently conditional on not asking difficult questions about equal treatment was, by Gary's account, deeply painful. Legal proceedings followed. Gary pursued claims related to his treatment and his dismissal, and the dispute became public in a way that created significant discomfort around the show's carefully cultivated image. Mrs. Brown's Boys had always presented itself as a particular kind of thing, warm, genuine, chaotic, but loving. A legal dispute about alleged pay disparities and unfair dismissal sat very uncomfortably alongside that presentation. Brendan denied the allegations, describing the situation as a misunderstanding and expressing that he had tried to resolve matters privately. But the legal process was already in motion, and the coverage that surrounded it raised questions that couldn't be easily put to rest. Dino Doyle was not recast and was not given any farewell within the show's storyline. He simply ceased to appear, and the gap was left unaddressed. For viewers who had watched him for years, this was jarring, not just a loss of a character they were fond of, but the abrupt, unexplained nature of that loss, which felt at odds with the emotional generosity that the show usually extended to its departures. The absence of an ending made everything feel unresolved in a way that persisted long after the legal proceedings had run their course. Damien McKiernan's own exit from the show, which appears to have occurred around the same period as Gary Hollywood's, was similarly quiet and similarly unexplained. He had arrived under enormous pressure, tasked with replacing a fan favorite in a show where audience loyalty was deep and the tolerance for substitution was limited. He did the work professionally, and without complaint for the years he was part of the cast, navigating the constant comparisons to Rory Cowan with apparent equanimity. But he too appears to have been caught up in the turbulence surrounding the pay dispute, and his departure, like Gary's, came without a send-off scene or an on-screen explanation. He simply was no longer there. For Damien, the whole experience must have carried a particular kind of difficulty. Arriving as a replacement nobody initially wanted, working hard to earn an audience that was always partly mourning someone else, and then leaving under circumstances that were not of his making and were never properly explained. It's a kind of situation that follows an actor without being entirely their story at all. His connection to Mrs. Brown's Boys was shaped at every stage by forces outside himself, and his exit reflected that same quality of being caught in other people's decisions. Jennifer Gibney occupies an entirely different position in this story, because she is the one who didn't leave, at least not in any formal sense, but who nonetheless became noticeably less present over time. Her role as Kathy Brown, the psychologist's daughter trying to maintain some semblance of sanity inside her mother's household, had been central to the show's earlier seasons. Kathy was the straight character in a show full of anarchic comedy, the person whose exasperation the audience shared, the voice of reason that made everyone else's madness more visible and more funny by contrast. Jennifer played her with a dry precision that was harder to pull off than it appeared, because underreacting in the middle of chaos is its own specific skill. As the seasons progressed, Kathy appeared less frequently, with shorter scenes and a more peripheral role in major storylines. Audiences noticed and speculation followed, as it always does when something changes in a show that people feel proprietary about. Was there tension between Jennifer and Brendan off-screen? Was this a professional decision or a personal one? The reality, as both Jennifer and Brendan have described it, is considerably less dramatic. Both of them had agreed that Kathy's role should be scaled back, partly to create space for other characters to develop, and partly because Jennifer felt the character had reached a natural point of diminishing creative returns. After years of failed romances and dry one-liners and being talked over by Agnes, the opportunities for finding something genuinely new with Kathy were becoming harder to identify. The decision was mutual and considered, arrived at between two people who happened to be both married to each other and creative collaborators of long standing. That dynamic, being both the show's creator and the husband of one of its principal cast members, is unusual enough that it creates its own set of pressures, and navigating those pressures requires exactly the kind of clear, honest communication that Jennifer and Brendan appear to have engaged in around Kathy's reduced role. The character didn't disappear entirely, but she receded, and the show adapted to her absence from the foreground in ways that were not always seamless.